Are you looking for security architect interview questions? If so, this video is for you. Hi, my name is Mike Gibbs, and in today's video, we're going to give you security architect interview questions and cloud security architect interview questions, and the types of answers that will get you hired. The first security architect interview question I'll ask this week is, how do you perform an enterprise-wide risk assessment? And that's a very common security architect question. Here's how I would answer it. I would say that I always start with the business context. For example, what are the revenue generating systems? What systems are critical for operations? And then I ask questions like, what would materially impact operations, impact our brand, or impact our organization and its regulatory standing? And then at that point, I will map out whatever capabilities we need in that business and whatever applications support those key business capabilities. And then ultimately, we have to tie that back to the underlying infrastructure. And that way, I have really full visibility into what we actually need. Now, at that point, we obviously have to identify the organization's critical assets. In many cases, you hear them referred to as the crown jewels. And that could be customer data. It could be financial systems. It could be intellectual property, for example. But we need to identify those critical assets. Then after we know what our assets actually are, then I typically start analyzing threats and vulnerabilities and impact. And I'll explain what I mean by that. From a threats perspective, who would target this asset and why would they target it? For example, from a vulnerability perspective, where are we exposed? And then from an impact perspective, what happens to the business if this fails or if this threat were to occur, for example? And when we know all of that, that's when I start prioritizing risks based upon the likelihood of the risk and its business impact. I validate the risks and my assessment of these risks with the organization's key stakeholders because, in security, we architects don't decide risk alone. The business must agree. And then we make all of this very clear. I make this very clear with executives in terms of executive communication, executive presentations, and enterprise risk registers, maybe some heat maps that are aligned to business impact, and any kind of prioritized steps to get the organization to where it needs. The next security architect interview question will be, how do you translate technical risks into business impact for executives? And this is another very common question, and they're trying to see if you've got the business acumen and the CXO relevance for a security architect career. So here's how I would answer that question. I keep my conversations with executives executive relevant. That means I'm going to translate technical issues into business issues. So what is the impact on revenue? What happens operationally if there's a disruption in our technology? What happens if we're exposed from a regulatory perspective? If we were breached, what would that do to our brand in terms of our reputation, for example? And what I like to do is I want to quantify whatever's possible. So I've got numbers to present to those executives in terms of financial exposure, in terms of cost of downtime, in terms of customer churn, something that is relevant to the executives. And then at that point, once we understand what we're dealing with, then I start trying to present options. So option A is low cost, but it'll give us moderate risk reduction. Option B is a higher cost, but it gives us significant risk reduction. And then at that point, I'm going to make a recommendation. And in my recommendation, I'm going to be using very clear example language. And if it's a C-suite or above it or a board, it'll be CXO relevant language. I won't communicate with any acronyms or any jargon. My conversation will focus exclusively on risk, cost, financial impact, and the likelihood of something occurring. The next question for security architects is, how would you design a risk-based security architecture? And again, this is a common security architect interview question because they want to see, what are you actually solving? Are you looking at the tech or are you looking at the actual risk? So here's how I would answer that. I would say I design security around risk. That means the first thing I want to do in my security architecture is to identify the key assets. and determine which assets are going to need the most protection, because not all assets are equally valued, and our security plan must reflect that. Then what we need to really do is really map out the types of threat scenarios that exist. For example, what happens if a credential was compromised? What happens if a ransomware attack were to occur to us? What happens if data was exfiltrated or left the system? What happens if there's an attack on our supply chain? Because we really need to understand what happens based upon these various threats. And then we've got a full perspective of the picture. Then we need to apply some security controls. And that means, for example, high-risk systems will need the strongest controls. Low-risk systems may get away with some lighter controls. Okay, the next question is, how do you manage third-party or vendor risk? And in today's world of outsourcing systems to cloud providers and software as a service providers and other providers that are monitoring systems, this has become a big issue, and that's why it's being asked a lot on security architect interviews. So here's how I would answer the question, how do you manage third-party or vendor risk? I would say that third-party risk in today's world is one of the biggest attack surfaces for the modern enterprise. So controlling this risk is going to be absolutely critical. Now, for me, I typically want to start with a classification of the vendors, because not all vendors are created equal, and not all vendors have equal access to our system. So I will first start looking at the most critical vendors, those with access to sensitive data or where we host sensitive systems. I'll then be looking at, moderate vendors, as well as even low-risk vendors. And then when I look at the vendors, I'm going to assess them based upon data access. I'm going to base them based upon network access, the level of integration we have, so I know where those risks really occur. And I am going to make sure that before we onboard any vendors that we've got some good security questionnaires to understand how they manage their systems. We'll be looking at various certifications to make sure they're adhering to certain controls like SOC 2 or ISO 27001. Whenever possible, we'll be doing architecture reviews on our critical vendors to make sure that they're meeting our security needs. Now, because some things are out of our control, many things are, one of the things we can do is enforce contractual security requirements. So that means we're going to be very diligent with that. Any kind of data protection clauses, any kind of breach notifications, any kind of SLAs, whatever our minimum security standards are, and we need to make sure and vet that vendor to make sure that it actually means that. And then whenever possible, we're going to try to control what can't be controlled in the third party with some technical controls. For example, we may use a cloud access security broker to enhance the security across SaaS applications. We'll be using whatever the least privilege access we can use. We will segment our network as much as we need to kind of protect the blast radius of things. We will encrypt whatever is encrypted. For example, if our systems are in a cloud provider and someone were to take those hard drives, we want to make sure that we're using encryption. And we're going to obviously constantly monitor the system. And then I really need to plan what happens in a failure situation, and we need to act accordingly in our architecture. What happens if this vendor is breached? How do we isolate that vendor, or how do we temporarily replace them or permanently replace them if we need? And then that means, we're going to be constantly monitoring those vendors, not just at onboarding. Did the vendor risk go up? Are they still a good vendor, for example? Is our external attack surface getting bigger? Are we able to monitor it, what have you? Now, the last security architect interview question I have for you in this video is, how do you define risk tolerance and risk appetite with leadership? Again, a very common security architect interview question. So here's how I would answer that question. I would say that risk tolerance is a business decision, not a security decision. And my goal as a security architect is really to educate and guide leadership as opposed to dictate risk tolerance. So to that end, what I'm going to do is facilitate discussions around the following. What type of loss is acceptable? And what level of loss is acceptable? What level of disruption to our services or our organization is tolerable? What regulatory risk can we absorb? Because that's going to drive everything. And then I'm going to translate that into, for example, quantifiable thresholds that I can discuss with management. For example, what is the maximum amount of downtime that this business can tolerate? Now that we know what, or at least we need to be sure of, what are the financial loss limits this organization can have? How much data exposure can this organization have? And when we actually know that and we've quantified that, now we're in a position where we can start looking at other things to analyze our risk appetite, risk tolerance. We want to benchmark it with industry benchmarks. We want to see if we're adhering to any kind of regulatory expectations. And we may want to think about how this might impact our competitive positioning, for example. And then when we know all that, now it's time to go back to the executives and present the scenarios clearly to drive clarity with the executive team. And that way we can say to the executive team, if we accept this level of risk, here's what a breach is going to look like. And then the executive team can make the decisions that they actually need. So that's what we're doing by translating our risk appetite into an architecture that the C-suite and the board can actually understand. I hope you enjoyed this video on security architect interview questions. And if you want to become a security architect or a cloud architect or an enterprise architect or an artificial intelligence architect, we run 2 completely free architecture webinars per week. And on these architecture webinars, we talk about what we do as architects, the skills you'll need to become an architect, how to get people to come to you as opposed to you applying and getting rejected by HR for any kind of an architecture job you want. Like I said, cloud architecture, security architecture, AI architecture. We'll discuss any of these on any of these architecture webinars that we run. And we run these webinars twice per week. They are live on Zoom, and you can register for the free architecture webinars by clicking the link in the description of this video. We also hold full career training programs for all the architecture careers like enterprise architecture, security architecture, AI architecture, or of course, multi-cloud architecture as well. If you enjoyed this video on security architect interview questions, please give it a like, subscribe to our channel, and hit the bell to be notified of new videos to assist you in your architect career. This is Mike Gibbs signing off for now, and hope to see you in another video or a webinar real soon.